what's good, mi gente? It's your boy Raul. Welcome back. This is How Do You Say Success in Spanglish. Today, my guest is Rafael Martinez. How's it going, Raf?
It's going well. Thank you for having me in the show.
Oh, of course, man. Thank you so much for joining me, and looking forward to be able to talk more about your journey and get some insight on the life that is, you know, that is your life. So, to kind of start off, just to give a little background, Rafael Martinez is an assistant professor of Southwest Borderlands in the College of Integrated Sciences and Arts. At ASU, he teaches courses on the American Southwest, Arizona history, the U.S. Mexico borderlands, in transporter Chicano literature. Rafael is also a program faculty for the MA Narrative Studies program in CISA. Rafael work focuses on immigration, migration, the U.S. Mexican borderlands, and the American Southwest. His forthcoming book with the University of Arizona Press, Illegalized, Undocumented Youth Movements in the United States, analyzes the rise of undocumented youth social movements in the U.S. and immigrant youth contributions to the border immigrant rights movements. Rafael's work engages in borderland studies to demonstrate how communities along the Mexico U.S. border contribute to the social, political, and economic fabric of the United States, which is a mouthful. So thank you very much for giving me all that to say. But very impressive, bro. Very, very, very impressive. Uh,
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's been a long trajectory, which I'm happy to share with you on the show. And this is, I think, a great model and a great medium to connect folks that be able to share their narrative, share their story, and basically, as Latinos, we're always talking about how did we make it, how did we get there. Well, we get to share a slice of that history with your audience.
Nice, awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I guess let's get with this. So tell me, who is Rafael Martinez?
Yeah, well, I'm a professor, as you heard in my intro. That's my day job. I always like to think of it as that way. But beyond that, I'm a father. I'm a son. I'm a partner to a great family, and I live in Arizona, particularly in Chandler, Arizona. Originally grew up in Guanajuato, Mexico. That's where I was born, and was raised in Los Angeles, California, and did graduate school at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and got the chance of graduating with my PhD right in the middle of COVID, if you can believe that. Graduating with the PhD after so long, so much work, so much hard work, basically no graduation, virtual graduation, get to leave through the back door after being in Albuquerque for so long. But all with the hopes of course, starting my career, my profession as a professor here at Arizona State University, which I've now been here for 4 years, starting on my fourth year. And yeah, so that's a little bit in a nutshell who I am. I like to be involved in community work. Not necessarily consider myself an activist, but more so an organizer and really cultivate and build community. And everywhere that I've lived, that's something that's really important to me. And really now my biggest motivation is being a father and hopefully being able to offer something to the next generation, including my daughter's generation.
Nice, awesome, man. I mean, yeah, as a father, I totally get that last part of it. Everything else is great, and then you have a kid, and it's like, oh no, nothing's as great as this. You feel you. So tell me, I mean, obviously you came into this country from Mexico. How old were you when you came to the country?
Yeah, so I actually got here of all days, Cinco de Mayo of 1990, and my birthday is May 28th. So essentially, just little under 20 days before my fourth birthday. So I was 3 years old, going on four when I arrived to the country, and basically. Like most Mexican families, the idea was to come here for a few years, work hard, make some money, and maybe make a business or make a life back in Mexico after a few years of some income. But though that 2 years, 4 years, 5 years turned into, a lifetime. And basically, like a lot of our immigrant families that live here in the US or have now called the US home. And so has my family. And, I always think about that decision and then the tough decision my parents must have had to make. But I think, overall, it's been for the best of myself, my sister, and of course, our growing family.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also I came to this country about the same age as you when I was about a little over 3. Also undocumented. I don't think my parents had planned to go back at all. I think they just came to stay. But yeah, no, I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from. And so, growing up, you guys were undocumented. Um, did you recognize or understand some of the challenges early on, or that's something you kind of started learning later on in life?
Yeah, again, I think back to now that I'm a parent and thinking about parents' decisions and what they share with their children, what's the appropriate age to share things with your children. But I think my parents from a very early age, I feel like I always knew what my status was. I always knew my realities, and my parents talked openly about those realities and situations in our household. And I think that was something that, um, whether we like it or not, como si quieres o no quieres, like as a kid, to speak in Spanglish, along with the show name, um, you have to grow up fast in some ways and really be open to those realities. And so I think at a very early age, I already had some very critical questions and a self-awareness about my family's status, but also how we were similar or different to other American families. Other families in my neighborhood were very similar. I grew up in a part of LA, South Central LA, that's predominantly Latinx and Black or African American, with a heavy concentration of immigrants. So luckily, I feel like I grew up in a place where my story was not, out of the norm or necessarily atypical. But I grew up with a lot of neighbor friends who were also undocumented, were also immigrant families, and so I think that helped me, kind of feel like, oh, I'm not out of place, even though I'm in a foreign country or a different country. But it also, I think, gave me a lot of the critical questions that I don't think most 6-year-olds or 8-year-old when I started coming of age was asking like, hey, why does my neighborhood look the way that it does? Why is it that we drive, 20, 30 minutes and those neighborhoods look radically different? I think a lot of those questions. And then also LA was going through a lot of changes. California was going through a lot of changes in the early 90s as well. And so my parents always listened to the Spanish radio when we were driving to school or work, or we were watching the afternoon news while we were making dinner and things of that sort. So I feel like news and political messaging and all those things were always in the back of my ears or mind, if you will. And I think like I always interacted with all of that messaging at a very early age, and try to formulate like who I was as a person, as an individual, and also who I wanted to be, essentially, and in the future. And my parents never shied away from taking me to their jobs, to their work. And part of it was out of necessity. Many of the times they didn't have places to necessarily leave me. But I would see their hard work that they would perform. My Both of my parents who come from the same town where I was born, Guanajuato. It's called Moroleon, Guanajuato, and it's basically an industrial town. It's not an agricultural town, but it's an industrial town that primarily focuses on garment industry. So they sew and make clothes and shoes and things of that sort. So that was another natural transition for coming to Los Angeles because LA is one of the has a huge garment industry, that's worldwide essentially. And so when my parents got there, I got to see. I went to their factorias, their factories where they worked. A lot of people would call them sweatshops because they're not the best of conditions. And so as a little kid, I would see them, how hard they would work, how many hours they would work, and they would always tell me, you could choose to do this labor if you want to, or you could choose to stay in school and pursue something else. And I think that's something that always stuck. I didn't quite understand, of course, at that age and time, but that's something that always stuck with me. Is that, oh, okay, well, there's a few options. There's not one option. You don't have to choose to stay in the destiny or kind of what you're born into or what your family has done, you could aspire for something else. And I recognize that my parents were also making that sacrifice, coming to a country that wasn't theirs, speaking a language that necessarily wasn't there, and adopting to a culture that wasn't theirs. So for me, it was, where do I want to make that sacrifice count the day of tomorrow? And so that's something that, I was stuck. They didn't necessarily know how to navigate the educational system or tools, but they always gave me the confidence and the motivation and the support to say, whatever you decide, as long as it's something positive and within school or sports, we're going to go ahead and try to do our best to support it. And so a lot of times I would be the one looking up, programs or after school programs, tutoring, all these other different things that we could do. And they always said yes, as long as they could afford it and as long as they could do it and support me, they always did. And so that's something that I think always stood with me.
Yeah, I think it's always the hindsight as you get older to kind of look back and say, "Oh, I didn't feel like an immigrant all my life, but I recognize things now where it's like, you know, there was things we had to do. We had to be very, we never caused trouble with the landlord because we didn't want nobody to call somebody on us, or we avoided things with the police, or But you just kind of were growing up, and you're just like, oh, that's just like living. And then you get old and you recognize, okay, my parents are doing this, and we're doing this, and they literally, and back in the day, you left your family and you might not have talked to them for 6 months to a year. It's not like now where you can FaceTime everybody every day and WhatsApp people the ask, but it's just, it was a big sacrifice. And we as you grow older, you recognize you notice that, and I think it helped drive me. And so did I know you said education was important to you, but what was a big driving factor for you when it came to education? Was it just seeing the differences in potential work, or was it sacrifices?
Yeah, I think you know there's several factors I think that push me to education. One of the ones is kind of I briefly talked about, which was really trying to understand this new environment or the U.S., if you will, right? Where I was asking very critical questions, and it sounds a little cliche, but it's true. Like, I remember very clearly when the Rodney King beating happened, in 1992 in LA, that, basically I remember my parents telling me, hey, we came here for a better life. And all of a sudden my city's on fire, right? Like I look outside my window and my city's on fire. And so I literally remember saying like, well, why did this happen? And the only response that the news was telling me is like, oh, this motorist did something wrong and people are upset with it because they're African American. And then, like this whole issue about race being so big, right? And so even though I was an immigrant, I was like, oh wow, like well, there's a history here of people being treated a certain way if you look a certain way and if you live in a certain place, right? And so all of those things for me started asking all these questions. Then when I got to, I think I didn't really think about, college or any of those things until I started getting to like middle school and high school. And in particularly, I started getting stuff. I made really good mentors. I feel like I always had good history teachers all the way through, and I feel like that just pushed me in that direction. Again, having all these questions where I was trying to make sense of my world, make sense of the U.S. and my place in it. And when I took world history in middle school, it was like, oh, like, learning about all the civilizations and learning non-Western civilization that they had great things like in Americas, in Mexico, Central America, South America, all these different places that people had done accomplished great things before colonial conquest. And so all of those things I think stood with me all the way up to like high school and then again having really good mentors. And then when I got to college and really, found my first mentors within taking Chicana and Chicano studies courses, that formed like the consciousness that I had been looking for all of my life, where I was trying to answer these questions or trying to ask the right questions, I should say, And then I realized, through professors that said, "Oh, you know what? The type of questions that you're asking are like research questions, right? They're questions that require, in-depth analysis, looking at archives, looking at records, being able to think about this stuff and write about these things." And I said, what is all of that? And I didn't know what doing research meant. I didn't know what being a professor meant. I just thought of it as a teacher for college students.
Mhm.
But it was really through their models and through their examples that I realized that that was something I wanted to pursue. That I wanted to be like some of those professors who were able to teach and research, but also teach the next generation about these things. Because I knew that if I was growing up with these questions, I'm sure a lot of other kids in the hood, a lot of other kids in different cities across the U.S were growing up in similar in different ways as well with similar questions that needed those answers. And so that was really a big part of my motivation. But again, really it started with my parents, that foundation of saying, we came to the US for a better life. Education is really the pathway. And then the last thing I'll say about that, and we could expand maybe a little later, was that as an immigrant, as an undocumented person at the time, um, education felt like the safe bet, right? If I'm not, if I'm gonna not be, if I'm gonna graduate and not gonna be eligible necessarily to have a job, I'm just gonna stay in school as long as I can, right? But why graduate? Just get a degree, and so education felt like a safe bet because when I talked to my professors, when I talked to my teachers from middle school, high school, and then college, they understood me. They supported me. They were okay with my status and who I was. It was the rest of society, if you will, that didn't feel like a safe place of like not being able to get a job and certain politics, federally and state level politics that restricted you from doing other things. And so, in some ways, education felt like a safe bet, pretty much to now, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting the way you speak you put it that it's a safe bet because there are so many challenges, and so for people who might not understand, as I think people sometimes have a pretty broad brush that they paint undocumented immigrants with, and they don't recognize the challenges that we have. But can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges you had, especially when it came to like college and high school and things like that, as an undocumented immigrant?
Yeah, yes, of course. And so, growing up undocumented, you really don't start hitting a wall, I would say, until you start coming of age, really your late teens and about to enter college. For me, I remember, being in high school and all of my friends starting to get their driver's licenses and getting their cars, some of them getting cars and being able to drive around and hang out and all that cool stuff that everybody associates with being able to drive. Well, at the time in California, undocumented communities weren't eligible for a driver's license, right? And so I basically all of my time that I lived in California, which was all the way until I was 26 years old, I didn't drive. If anybody who listening to this who knows California or knows LA, who would probably be like freaking out because they're like, "How did you get around if you never drove in LA? Like LA is a driving city, like you can't get around." And so it was a lot of public transportation, taking the bus everywhere, the metro everywhere, getting rides, friendships. I think that, when I go back to LA and I see a lot of my friends, the first thing I remember is, getting rides from them and then just, being able to listen to their radio stations, to their music and hanging out with them. Because again, that was such like when we think about allyship and being allies to other communities that are marginalized or vulnerable, we think of the big things, but it's the little things that make a difference. In this case, giving somebody a ride who can have access to a driver's license, right, is such a big deal. And so, yeah, in high school, that was the case. A lot of my friends started getting their first jobs in high school, going into college. Again, I wasn't eligible to have a work permit or be able to work legally in the US. So my parents said, hey, So let's just put that off. Let's wait until you're a little bit older. So all my friends were, driving, getting their job, buying new shoes, new kicks, everything else. And for me, I'm just like stationary. I felt like, I'm in place, if you will, and that was very frustrating. If you think of teenagers today who have access to everything really quick on their phones, and material culture is so big in the United States, that was such a frustrating, tough, and carried a lot of anger. And to this day, I'll be honest, I think a lot of people don't understand that my whole episode in California was undocumented. So every time that I think about California, or every time I go back to California, California or LA for me represents the struggle, right? It represents the hardship. I'm literally driving through LA, and I'll look at, a bus stop, and I'll look at it in a different light every single time that I go back, because I remember those things, and that frustration in some ways is still there, and things like that. So those were tough. Once I got to college, I decided to go to my local state school, and a big part of that was affordability, and also again mobility. Right, I couldn't travel to another school, so I literally went to the school that was closest to me, and that was affordable to me. State schools are much more expensive today in California, but luckily at that time, they were much more affordable. I remember paying as low as $900 a semester for tuition, right? Which is still a considerable amount for an immigrant family. But thankfully, again, my parents supported and with their help. And then eventually I did start working. My first job was working drive through at McDonald's. I'm not ashamed to say it, right? That was my job all through my undergraduate career. It was McDonald's that was closest to my university. So I went to work from 4 a.m. I got off at 2. I got off at 12, and then basically did afternoon classes. I walked to my university from work, and did afternoon classes, and then basically, took the bus home and was home by like 8 or 9 p.m. that evening. And so that was my reality basically for my undergrad was about 8 years. And again, when I tell people that I spent 8 years in undergrad, they're like, "Well, why did it took you so long to graduate?" I said, "Well, there was times where I was taking not full term classes. I was just taking a few classes at a time to be able to pay for it. And there was times where, again, I was like, I'm not going to graduate. There's no reason for me to graduate the day of tomorrow. So I just kept taking credits and taking credits. Luckily, there was in-state tuition in California. And I shouldn't say luckily, but, actually in my research and in my book that I talk about in my book, which we'll talk about in a minute, part of that research was looking at how immigrant youth and undocumented youth have been fighting and organizing in California as early as the 1980s to get in-state tuition in California. That actually didn't happen until the early 2000s, right? So by the time that I get to college in 2004, we already had in-state tuition in California. Texas, of course, is the first state that passes in-state tuition for undocumented youth in 2001. Surprisingly, because that has changed over time in Texas as well. But yeah, so by the time that I get to college, I'm able to qualify for in-state tuition, and that made a world of a difference. We didn't have state aid at the time in California. That came much later. So after I graduated, during the time that I was an undergrad, I organized with people all across the state to pass what's now the California Dream Act. And the California Dream Act is what gave undocumented youth in not only in-state tuition, but also state aid, where they could apply for state aid, and be able to apply that for their scholarships and to go to college. I didn't have any access to that, but I was proud and happy to say that, like many other youth, we fought for that, and we got that, and that's in place now for students and today's colleges all across California. But those were some of the challenges. Again, mobility, access to education, paying for college out of pocket, essentially, and then getting that first job that was not the easiest and not the desired job, but I'm still proud to say that it helped out and got me through my undergrad.
Yeah, and it's kind of hilarious that, there's a negative picture sometimes for these low skill jobs that for someone who can't get a job, like, how did you feel, like, at the moment you finally got a job, you're like, how did you feel?
Um, Honestly, I was just excited. I was just excited to have a job to be able to say, "Oh my god, I'm gonna have a paycheck. So I'm not gonna depend on my parents anymore. I'm not gonna put that burden on my parents anymore." I could access, things. It was a big deal, and I remember because I'll tell you a quick anecdote. And I share this with close friends, but I remember applying for a job at Universal Studios, Hollywood, and I went through the whole application process. I got interviewed for it, and I basically got made the cut. I mean, there was like hundreds of us that got interviewed and everything, and I'm like 18, 19-year-old kid, and I get hired for one of their shows actually in the concert hall, and it's like this big deal because I'm like, oh my god, I'm gonna be able to see concerts, blah blah. And then I get a phone call and they're like, hey, we're having issues with your paperwork. Can you come into the office and like let's talk about it and just bring in your paperwork and you got the job. And of course, I never called them back. I never, I never followed up. I was like, there goes that opportunity. So I was really bummed out, because that would have been a cool job. But then when I got landed a job in McDonald's, I was like, you know what? Like this, anything is good. Having that culture and that having access to money and be able to work and support yourself, that's a big deal. So yeah, no, I think that it was just a big deal at the time for sure. And I'm still grateful for it. And I'm grateful for the experiences because I think that even though it was a low skill job, I learned so much from that job and I learned customer service. I learned how to not be shy, how to talk to people, how to get out of very difficult situations. You name it. Yeah, you go through. You see so many experiences in fast food industry that you have to learn quick. And as a 19-year-old, I feel like I had to learn quick there as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel sometimes like immigrant humility is a big part of our lives. Like taking the small things and making them feel great. So, so obviously you were in college, and did you get access? You talking about Dreamer and all that stuff? Did you eventually get access? Well, help with the DACA as well?
Yeah. So, I stayed in touch with my mentor and advisor through my undergrad, and I organized with her. And she actually moved to the University of New Mexico 2 years before I was set to graduate. Or was even thinking of graduating. I stayed in touch with her. She became the director of Chicano Studies at UNM. And she called me once and she said, "Hey, are you still interested in grad school?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, what's stopping you?" And I said, "Well, money. Like I don't have money for grad school." And she said, "Well, I think if you're interested, I think there's opportunities out here that we could support with that." And I was like, well, that's all the opportunity and the help that I need. So I'm down. I'm all for it. And so I stayed in touch with her for those 2 years. Finally worked on graduating, and I graduated. Spring 2012, and of course, DACA or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals that President Obama announced as an executive action happened on June 15 of 2012. Right. So I had been saving up for forever on my McDonald's job. I saved all the money that I could to make the transition and move to New Mexico. At that point, DACA hadn't been announced, so I was literally just counting on this opportunity and making the best out of it. When the announcement happens the summer of 2012, I mean, that just changed my life. It was just like, oh my God, like I'm gonna have access to a work permit. I'm gonna be able to, be in the U.S. legally. It just made a world of difference. But it was still a little bit like, is this thing really gonna happen? Like you still have all those doubts and like, is this real or like, something gonna happen? But I start my master's program at UNM in the fall of 2012. And so I applied that fall 2012 to DACA, and so after my first semester, I think I got DACA my first time maybe like late November, early December. So that first semester, it didn't really kick in or make a big effect, if you will. But of course, by my second semester, now I was able to legally work on campus. So right away, I got a graduate assistantship, meaning that I was working with a professor, being mentored by a professor, and doing research right off the bat. Um, and that basically assistantship not only covered my tuition, right? So I didn't have to pay for tuition out of pocket, and it gave me a monthly stipend, right, which was plenty to live off of. Luckily, Albuquerque, New Mexico, is a very affordable city and a very affordable place, and so. It was just a perfect scenario, but yeah, that was the game changer, I would say, because my whole experience again in California as an undergrad had been undocumented, which presented all those hardships that I just outlined a minute ago. And then for my graduate school in New Mexico, it was completely the opposite. It was just night and day. It represented all the opportunities that I didn't have as an undergrad. And I had a job. I was able to legally be in the United States. New Mexico also had driver's licenses, so right away, my second semester, I take my driver test, and I luckily pass it, and I get a driver's license. And I didn't get a car right away, but just to be able to drive made a world of a difference. And so, yeah, my whole experience as a graduate student, from my master's to my PhD, that I was there in New Mexico for about 8 years, was just radically different from my undergrad experience, thanks to this program DACA that we still have today, and which is what I'm still qualified under as a DACA recipient.
Nice, nice. Where's the first place you drove to once you get your license?
Well, as mentioned, we're fraternity brothers, and so one of the things that I did was help start a chapter there at the University of New Mexico.
Mhm.
And so right away, we had tons of brothers that helped out with that process from Texas, right? That drove out from Texas to New Mexico, brothers from California that helped out. So, right away, I told the brothers in New Mexico, hey, we got to repay those debts. Let's go ahead and take road trips to Texas, to California. And so I feel like almost every break that we had, like a spring break, fall break, or like summer break, we were taking road trips to one of those places, which I remember like those brothers that I took those road trips with. Those are like just such memorable experiences because they literally. I remember them like making fun of like my driving. They were saying that I drive like a grandpa because I'm like literally behind the wheel, like all tense and nervous and everything, going the speed limit. And I was like, chill guys, like you gotta understand, like I'm 27 years old and this is like the first time I'm able to like legally or actually able to drive. And so, yeah, I mean, that was literally my learning experience with brothers, and then being able to drive to all these places and finally be on the road. And I feel like since then, I still value road trips so much more now that I'm able to do them with my family and go on road trips, because I feel like again, something as simple as like a driver's license or driving, we take for granted in the United States. And so just having access to that mobility. So I try to be mindful of those things. But yeah, so I think probably Texas was the first place that we drove through for a road trip.
Nice. Yeah, good old Texas. I miss Texas. Good times. I think it was formal. I think formal might have been one of the ones you guys went to. Yeah,
I think so. I drove.
I'm sorry, that's formal. Mhm. So yeah, I remember that. It's a long time ago. I'm old, but no, that's also tell me about it. So yeah, dude, and that's awesome. And you know, I think one of the things you keep bringing up is mentorship, the importance of mentorship and how it affected you. And you put something in your pre-interview questions, the rule of three from mentorship. Can you explain that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I learned this from a colleague, and I feel like I've always, in some ways, been doing this informally, but it wasn't until like a colleague of mine and a mentor of mine explained it to me, where she said, ideally there's a rule that you should think of it as a rule of three to mentorship, where ideally you have three people for different realms of your life that you can ask for support on a given moment, right? So of course we tend to think of the division of our life in terms of like our career, professional life, our personal life. If you're into sports or anything like that, your athletic life or exercising, things of that sort, right? I like running, for example. And so, like, if you like exercising, like, you could have three runners or three exercise friends that know much more about exercising than you do that could help you out with like meeting your goals and things of that sort. The same thing with your career, right? I always tend to think of like, I want to have colleagues and friends who can support and who've already gone through the steps that I'm currently going through right now. So, for example, right now, as an assistant professor, I'm working towards tenure, which is basically on your fifth or sixth year of being an assistant professor. Then you get promoted to an associate professor. Once you become an associate professor, you're there for good, right? in the sense that you now have a terminal contract. You still get promoted through the ranks, if you will, but you're not getting evaluated in terms of your contract being questioned, if you will. Right now, as an assistant professor, when you get evaluated towards tenure, they could either give you that promotion, or they could say, thank you for your service. It's time to look for another job, essentially. Which sounds very scary, right? But the way that people tell you is that you got hired for your potential and the work that you've already been doing, that you're going to be expanding on that. But you have to meet milestones in that process. And so, since I got to ASU, since I got to being a professor, I've had colleagues and friends of mine who've already gone through the tenure process. Who some of them are from within my field or a discipline, and some of them are from with outside discipline or field. Um, and that's important, right? Because oftentimes you're going to get certain information from people within your area of influence that are going to tell you things. But it's also good to get perspectives, even though you're in the same career or in the same job, if you will, from people outside of that sphere of influence that could add or bring you a fresh pair of eyes. But ideally, you want to have three people that you could count on. That if all three people are telling you similar information, then it's more to be true, if you will, or that you want to follow certain paths. But also that you take we're all different personalities, so you want to take different qualities, different attributes, different assets from that piece of advice that works for you. Because I think the other thing about mentoring that oftentimes we forget, that mentoring isn't about telling people what to do. It's about sharing, first of all, listening rather than sharing, listening to what a person wants to accomplish and do. And, if they're asking you for suggestions or recommendations, then possibly giving them to them and say, this is what has worked for me. These are things to consider and things to think about. And then as the mentee is thinking about what works for you in your scenario. So you take bits and pieces from those three individuals that you resort to for questions. And I think I think of people as assets just as much as, any other tool or resource that you can have available to you. People are assets, people are knowledge. And so if I don't know how to do something or I'm trying to do something, before I even Google it, before I even, um, do anything else, I reach out to people that I know are in my realm of three in that particular area or discipline or whatever question I might have. And it's kind of like within a large network, right? Like we're talking about our fraternity, within our large network that we have access to. You have people in academia, so those people could be part of your three. You want to have three individuals in whatever questions, whatever area that you might be seeking advice for, and be able to have those folks. So thinking about the different areas of your life, you want to just keep but think about those relationships as fostering. So it's not just being able to exchange, give and take, but also friendships that you're cultivating, right? You also need to be those one of those three for people in the future as well. So you have to foster those relationships and water that garden essentially, and making sure those friendships grow.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm the worst when it came to like finding mentorship in my life. So I went a long time without having. I still don't even know if I have mentors really in my life, but I'm doing my best to try to take advantage of my peers as mentors at this point, with especially with the fraternity and the brothers I have. So I think lots of times early on we look at older people as our mentors, and at this point, some of your mentors could literally be people your age, even younger, that have accomplished things that you haven't done yet, and you want to get their insight. So, I think it's important for people to realize that it's not too late to look for mentors or find mentors. It's I think it's a valuable tool to use throughout your life, even as you get experience. So, but obviously, mentorship was important to you. Yeah, I think it helped you eventually to get to where you're at now. So, tell me what your journey was like to become a professor or assistant professor.
Yes, yeah. So when I started graduate school and then the master's program, I always knew that if okay, I made it this far, master's, again, had DACA, but didn't know what the situation with immigration was going to be. So again, education felt like the safe bet. And so, the idea of the PhD or a doctorate was always, around and saying, if I'm going into academia, PhD's the route. So, I had good mentors and particularly one really great mentor. And I really took, beyond being a professor, doing research and teaching classes, I also looked at her as an example of how you can use education and higher education to mentor the next generation, to cultivate community, and to craft strategically craft spaces in higher education to ensure that underrepresented voices are heard and included in the process of higher education. And so it was through her example that I realized, oh, it's not just about teaching, it's not just about, researching and publishing, but it's also about, mentoring and working with students on this level. And so, for my master's, I was contemplating going elsewhere for the PhD, but I felt like I had the support system. I had already built a community there at UNM, but also in Albuquerque and New Mexico more broadly. So I decided to stay there for the PhD. I did my MA and PhD in American Studies, which is an ethnic studies field, basically learning the history of diverse ethnic communities in the United States. But my research still focused particularly on immigrant youth and undocumented youth and immigrant rights more broadly. When I got to UNM in 2012, I mentioned that DACA had just passed. One of the things that I had the privilege of doing was that with my mentor, we organized a symposium at UNM in 2012 where we hosted organizers, activists from all over the United States, and scholars from all over the United States who were doing things around immigrant rights. And so we hosted them. We did the symposium. We recorded all the sessions, video recorded and audio recorded all the sessions. And I don't know if it's ever happened to you. I'm sure it's happened to all of us that sometimes you don't realize you're living a historical moment when it's unfolding in front of your eyes,
Hmm.
and you're like, it's not until much later that you're like, wow, like I still need to process this, like this is a big deal, and that's what that symposium was for me. When it came time to start thinking about my PhD dissertation, which is writing your research for your dissertation, I came back to that symposium and I said, you know what? This is what I want to write. I want to write about the history in the way that undocumented youth, particularly in the 21st century, have changed the way that we talk about immigrant rights today. And I learned, and I kept up with a lot of those activists. I followed their activism, their actions. I'm very much good friends with many of them today. I keep up with them on social media and things of that sort. And so, that's basically what evolved into my dissertation for my PhD. And really, what I worked on for all of my PhD. And then, I knew that I wanted to be a professor already at that point when I started the master's and went into the PhD. Of course, because of my status, it was always like, well, there's nobody been, an immigrant or a person with DACA who's a professor, right? Like,
Mhm,
how does that happen? And I remember talking to, because now we've had a large number of undocu scholars, which means,
mhm,
scholars who are in academia who come from an undocumented background or perspective, who have DACA like myself. And so I remember reaching out to a few of them and going through this process, and many of them reaching out to me as well, or people that reach out to me now and say, "How did you do it?" And I always go back to this, because my fear was like, well, how am I going to get hired?
mhm,
Right? Well, and they say, well, you have a social security number and you have a work permit, right? So what's the problem? They shouldn't ask any questions. You have the legal right to work. They have the legal right to hire you.
mhm,
So what's the problem? And so it literally dawned on me it was that simple. But again, you go through all these years of like, can I do this? Will I do this? That it just almost feels surreal that that's a possibility. And so luckily, like I said, I went from the PhD. I went on the job market, 2019. The academic job market's usually about a year long in terms of
mhm,
you apply, let's say in the fall, and then if you get a job, it won't start until the following fall. And
mhm,
so I interviewed for the job that I got at ASU in fall. I did my campus visit, meaning I went to visit the campus and did additional interviews at ASU in early February. I came back from the campus visit and they told me it would take about, a month to 2 months for me to hear back from them. They called me about 2 weeks later, offering me the job in
nice.
like mid February, which I was like just shocked and surprised and just in tears, like I couldn't believe it. I remember getting that call and being on the driving and being in the car. So I pulled over, and I was with my daughter, who's she was only like 3 at the time, and she was just like she couldn't understand anything, like what's going on, like why is my dad crying, and I just remember like hugging her and like just being so happy about that whole experience. But it was crazy. So I get the job. I take the job mid February, and then by early March, everything's on lockdown. Everything's closed down because of COVID, right? And so then you go into this whole panic mode, like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? Like, am I even gonna get this job? Like, I was of course paying attention to the news, and many universities were furloughing people and many jobs were not penning through because people institutions were having to figure out their budgets and
Mhm,
scenarios of what was going to happen for this unprecedented time of COVID. Luckily, I that didn't happen with me. The offer still went through and everything happened. And it was a really great offer. And I couldn't have think of a better place to start my career than
nice.
Arizona State University, because it's been a great place for me to start my career, and really great colleagues, great atmosphere. And of course, it was hard to move during COVID, in the middle of COVID, getting to Arizona, and literally the day that we moved here, it was like 120 in terms of heat.
Yeah.
So it was like a rude awakening in so many ways. But no,
Yeah.
it's been great. So that's a little bit of that trajectory, going from like the research, the dissertation, to then getting the job offer at ASU, and then of course the dissertations were turned into the book that's getting published, and will be out later this year.
Nice, nice. And it's funny, out of all the stuff you were worried about not being able to get a job, is damn virus that came along that give you the biggest scare, right? It's like it's nothing to do with your status, but that's awesome, man. And so you talked about your book, and I was going to ask you about your book, illegalized. I keep saying illegalized. Tell me a little bit about the book.
Yeah, of course. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the book essentially came out of meeting and really my whole adult life experience as the way that I describe it. And I start with this in the intro and kind of the preface, sharing a little bit of my positionality and my experience, but kind of saying that along while I'm experiencing all of this stuff in my personal life, social media had just started in the early 2000s, right? So if you remember MySpace, then Facebook, and all of those good things, a lot of my social media feed at the time was when undocumented youth had started to organize
Mhm,
and do actions all around the United States and really take activism to places where it hadn't been, before. As I described, the immigrant rights movement for historically had been a labor rights movement where basically, anything that was dealt with immigration only had to do with labor, right? Like exploitation of labor, uh, bad, working scenarios, all of these different things around labor. But it was never around identity. It was never around political issues. And certainly, immigrants were not the leaders of the movement themselves. It was for the most part civil rights organizations and civil rights leader who would basically tell immigrants, okay, like, what's your story? Okay, this is your story. Okay, sit in the back. Let me go ahead, and I'm the politician or I'm the authorized body. Let me go up and advocate on your behalf. Don't say anything, because if people hear your story, you're gonna get detained and you're gonna get deported, right?
mhm,
And that was the narrative for the longest time within immigrant rights, and until in the 2000s, when all these anti-immigrant policies started getting proposed. If you remember, one of my biggest moments was in 2006 and 2007. There were these giant marches that happened all around the United States for May 1st, or
mhm,
uh, the immigrant marches that began popping up every year.
mhm,
And some of those marches were the largest in some of the major cities across the US, including LA, where I lived at the time. And if you attended those marches like I did, the first thing that you saw was, again, the traditional messaging for immigrant rights movement. But then you saw immigrant youth who kind of fraction off and
mhm,
started, messaging differently. And so I document a lot of that history to show how that's really when undocumented youth started creating their own organizations and said, no, you know what, we're going to go ahead and be our own leaders. We're going
mhm,
to change the way we talk about immigrant rights, and we're going to take our activism to places that is affecting immigrant communities,
mhm,
right? When we think about immigrant rights, we think of the borderlands, we think of the US Mexico borderlands. But by the 2000s, the borderlands had moved into the interior of the country, because all the policies, the 11 million undocumented immigrants that are estimated, right? They've been living in the United States for a very long time. They're working in the United States, so the policy started being able to implement. We had Homeland Security born in 2001,
mhm,
ICE, after the terrorist attacks in 9/11. ICE became the branch that started detaining and detecting people in the interior of the country. And so, what the activists that I document is they start taking their activism, their civil disobedience, to places like detention centers, the US Mexico borderlands, and challenging the way that we talk about immigrant rights. And what resulted is basically what towards the end of the book, I talk about key phrases that we use today, like abolish ICE, nobody's illegal on stolen land.
mhm,
All of these different phrases that we hear about in mainstream media today, all of those came out of this particular movement where, undocumented, you change the way that we think about immigrant rights and the way that we talk about immigrant rights today. So,
mhm,
the legalized portion of the title is basically the activism showing how immigrants are rendered illegal in the United States in these particular ways, and showing that undocumented people themselves are not illegal, but it's actually things like detention centers that are violating human rights,
Mhm.
pointing the finger back at the state and showing how the state is responsible for basically committing illegal acts on immigrant or human beings themselves as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's. I remember those marches, both the early stages and even when we were marching in front of different detention centers and things like that in Houston when I was in Houston. So yeah,
Mhm.
it was all over the place, and it's awesome to see. I think that's one of the strongest things I think that's come out of social media. It's giving the youth a voice that spreads like wildfire now, and they can be more present. So that's awesome that you've been able to focus on that. I appreciate you taking the time to actually make a book about it and keep that hard coding that part of history in something that can't be taken away. So thank you for that. And so what's next for you? Like now that you've gotten all this stuff, obviously you got your book, you're still your assistant professor looking to get tenured. What are you looking forward to for in the future for yourself?
Yeah. Well, bef- I'll talk a little bit about some future plans, but really this year I'm excited for the book to be out, right? It comes out in October.
Yes.
We'll post a link. So hopefully
Yeah.
folks who are listening to this go out and you could pre-order it, get it, and it'll be delivered in October. But I've gotten a few book talk invites to different campuses. So if all goes as planned, when the book comes out mid-October, and ideally almost every week I'll be out of town, doing a book talk in different campuses, which is very much a blessing, right? Like that whole idea of going on a book tour to
Mhm.
me, again, just sounds surreal, and I'm very grateful. Because it's been, I see it as a trajectory of work that now I get to be able to share this with
Mhm.
different communities, and more importantly share it with immigrant communities too, that have gone through similar experiences and know what this means for our communities. So I'm really excited about that, but I'm also really just mentally, physically trying to prepare for that, because while traveling and visiting new places sounds great, it's also you know um, thinking about share responsibility with my partner and my daughter, and like all of those things. And then I'll still be teaching this semester, and so it's going to be a busy semester, but I'm looking forward to it.
Mhm.
And more towards the future, again, I'm looking. I'll be applying for tenure in the next 2 years. Along those lines, I'm still working on a few articles that I want to I'll be submitting and publishing, that will go into my portfolio. And ideally, it's not just about the tenure process, but now that I'm 4 years into being a professor, when I started, you go through this high anxiety, being at a place like ASU, that's a research one institution. What that really means is that our professors are mostly there to research. They are there to teach. I teach 2 courses every semester, but really what I'm mostly being evaluated is on my research, right? And I love teaching. I could teach all day. I could work with students all day, but the idea of sitting, alone, or in isolation and writing and submitting all these things, that's been a challenge, right? And I would always tell people the joke that, like, when I started as a professor, I felt like one of those old school rappers, like that would do the mixtapes and be like, album coming soon, and then like that album's like never coming out, right?
Mhm.
That's how being an academic feels, that you're like, oh yeah, I'm working on all this research, I'm working on this work, it's probably not going to be published for like 2 3 years, so like stay tuned for it, it's coming, it's
Mhm.
coming.
Mhm.
And so so I finally feel like I've been starting to publish much more, and things will be coming out, so it's a good relief, and all that good stuff. But honestly, the like that's the professional side, the academic side of my future aspirations. Now that I've been 4 years here in Arizona, I feel like I've been cultivating community here too. I've started several professional projects, but also community-based projects that I'm working with local communities where I live now, doing oral history projects, public history projects. And so for me, like what I'm also looking forward to, hopefully getting tenure and having that peace of mind, is also to really grow to call Arizona home, right?
Hmm.
Because I feel like we have gotten rooted here, and we are making community. This is where my daughter's now primarily growing up, so I want to you really make that a commitment to fostering her growth and her development, and her to be surrounded by a community that is going to foster her growth. Just like earlier, I mentioned the kind of like the mentoring of three. I tend to think of that with other people too. So even with our kids, like putting people and building community around them that are going to like support their growth, along the years. And so I think that's also the other thing that I'm looking forward to, is just being able to feel rooted. And I don't know if Arizona is going to be home forever, but it's somewhere where we're committed to as a family, for the next few years, where we want to grow and build. And yeah, I think that's another thing that I'm really looking forward to, is just continuing to build community and see our family grow here.
Nice. Nice. Awesome. I hope you get to do a little driving during your book tour. So
Yeah, no, actually, I'm looking forward to it. Some of them will be flyouts, but for sure, some of them will be road trips, and I'll
nice.
make them road trips.
Nice. Awesome. Awesome. Well, usually around this time in the podcast, I ask a question. If you could go back and talk to your younger version of yourself and give yourself a piece of advice, what's something you tell yourself?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I remember having or listening to some of your podcasts and some of your guests having really insightful responses to that. Uh, I feel like, honestly, the thing that comes to mind when I hear that question is, I would tell myself to be less anxious about the future. And of course, it's easier said than done, later on in life than it was when you're going through all those things. Um, but I would say, that anxiety, sometimes, sometimes we confuse anxiety for resilience,
Hmm.
right? Because sometimes out of anxious moments, we have to be resilient, or we tap into our resilience to get us to the next level, or get us to the next step that we need to in life. But we also, I think, in those anxious moments, we also, I think, sometimes fail to really appreciate and really think through everything that we're experiencing. Everything is just so, I need to make the next move, I need to like make the next decision, that we forget to, or don't have the privilege of appreciating, the good, the bad, and all of the things that come with our lived experience. So, I always look, like when I look at youth sometimes and I see their anxiety, like I talk to my students, and they're so worried about, getting that high paying job, and, you know, um, being able to fulfill their parents' dreams, and their expectations. I see so much anxiety in our youth, and I think a lot of that anxiety is placed on our youth, starting with our parents, all the way to educators and other folks that interact with youth. And I think one of the things that we just need to do is know that we all develop differently, and that we all grow in different ways. And so if I were to talk to myself, as you're playing the long game, don't be too anxious, right?
Hmm.
Don't want anything, too immediate, too soon. And not that I wanted it, but it could be very frustrating when you don't get results, super quick, or
Hmm.
you see others, and they have the privilege to be able to get results quicker than you do. um, so I would just tell people, myself mostly, to not be as anxious and take every step at a time and know that you're working towards these goals and you're taking the steps and that those things will come along. So yeah, that's what I would tell a younger version of myself, and also other people who are listening to the podcast, younger people, is take everything one step at a time, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes we gotta live in the moment. You know, people don't realize being an adult is the longest part of your life. You know, it's you know, so they're always trying to grow up, man, and then we get there and it's like, oh shit, when is this gonna end? It's 60 years, holy crap! Yeah, so no, it's hard, man. But no, I
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah.
that, man. And then so ultimately, my last question too for you is, so how do you say success in Spanglish? You know, what does success mean to you?
Yeah, that's another great question, and that's why I love the concept for your podcast so much, because again, I think it means different things to everybody or to different
Hmm.
people, right? But to me, success, I've always measured success by ideally, being able to set goals for yourself that are realistic and that you could accomplish, and that you ideally are always working towards next goals, and that you're fulfilled with those goals, and that you continue to try to meet the goals, whether it be personal goals, career goals, health goals, mental health goals. We're always uh, I feel like we're always striving towards balance, and sometimes there's moments in life where you have that balance and there's moments where you don't. Sometimes you're lacking in health, you're lacking in mental health, or you're doing really well and professionally, but maybe you need to do more health conscious things, right? So I think it's as success to me is striving like putting those next goals, but also finding that balance and not, again, desesperándote or being
Hmm.
frustrated to accomplish those things at any cost. No, it's setting realistic goals, right? Knowing that tomorrow I could possibly run 2 miles, but I can't run a marathon yet, right? I
Hmm.
need to work towards that marathon. Not to bring up Nipsey Hussle or anything, but thinking about we have to take those realistic goals, and so for me, it's putting those goals and being realistic, but also finding that balance.
Yeah.
And I define that success by how close we come to at particular moments to having balance in our life, and the best way that I think we can measure that balance is in our families,
Hmm.
right? If our family's healthy, our family's happy, and our family has those goals in mind, then I think that that puts us forward on the trajectory that we need to be. If our family's not, then that's when some of the issues come up. So I think that's how I define success.
Nice, nice, definitely, bro. And yeah, I mean, the whole you got to run before you become. You got to do a couple miles before you do a marathon, man. I tell that all the time. You know, the little progressive steps are going to be progress in big steps later. So, but thank you so much. Thank you for being here on the podcast today. Is there a website, something you want to talk about for your book or anything like that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share with you the link for the book, where
Hmm.
folks could access the book. Again, it's through the University of Arizona Press. You could order a pre-order book now. It'll be available on hardcover or paperback as well as ebook.
Nice,
But I'll put the book that will lead to folks being able to purchase the book as well. And again, it's called Illegalized Undocumented Youth Movements in the United States.
nice, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and everybody else out there. Don't forget to cop that mixtape when it comes out in October. The chicka chicka, yeah.
Heck yeah!
All
No,
right,
I literally, I'm gonna walk up on stage with the intro song.
bro. You should have like the cover on like a record and come out like with your headphones on.
There you go.
There we go.
Parental advisory
Yeah,
on the
exactly.
cover.
That's awesome, man. Well, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to everything for you in the future, brother. Take care.
No, thank you for the invite.
Of
Appreciate
course,
it.
man. Take care. And for everyone else, once again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope we'll continue to learn how to say success in Spanish.